this is the PowerPoint we looked at in lab. Just going over the endocrine slides. I thought I'd go over it one more time and just post it on Blackboard so you'd have it to refer to if you needed to. This is the pancreas. And the pancreas, as I mentioned, is a dual gland. It's both an exocrine and an endocrine gland. Now, the exocrine portion of the pancreas we'll look at with the digestive system. Most of its volume is made up of these cells that are exocrine cells or acinar cells or acini. These are the darker cells that you see all out here, all out here. If you look at them closely, they're arranged around a little duct that eventually leads into a larger pancreatic duct, which goes into the small intestine. So we're not too worried about that for this section. The other part, you'll notice this. I'll kind of go around it a bit. This thing right here, and there's probably another little smaller irregular one here. These are the islets of Langerhans. So there's a nice big round one here. That looks really nice. That's easy to identify. A lot of the ones on your slides kind of look more like this. They're still doable. Note they stain lighter. And really all you have to know about this at this point is these contain the endocrine cells. The two main hormones we'll talk about from the pancreas are insulin and glucagon, which play a role in controlling blood glucose or blood sugar levels. Insulin lowers blood sugar levels if it gets too high, and glucagon is just antagonistic. It does the opposite. It'll raise blood glucose or sugar levels. Main target, good target organ to put down is the liver. It does a lot with carbohydrate storage and metabolism, which includes glucose. So that's a decent target organ, and we already went over its action. So that is the pancreas. Same thing. This is at a much higher magnification than we'll typically use. I believe this is a 100-power oil immersion lens. But what you see here, this is the same slide, just at a higher magnification. That's the islet of Langerhans. And here you'll see the acini, the exocrine cells, kind of arranged in sort of little circles, and you can't really see them well, but there'd be a little duct in the middle of all of these groups of cells. All right, this is a thyroid gland. This is a fairly easy slide, and what you'll notice, it's got these fairly large and obvious big sort of circular structures here. Keep in mind this would be three-dimensional. This is a section, so these what look like circles on a section would be spherical structures, and they're made up of a single layer of cuboidal epithelial cells. I'm kind of outlining them here, and you can kind of see the nuclei. Oops, to use as a guide, I have a hard time drawing with a mouse, but these are the cuboidal cells right along here. So the combination of these cuboidal cells that make up sort of the perimeter, and all of this junk inside here, this is extracellular space. This is a solution containing a lot of proteins. It's sometimes called a colloid or specifically thyroglobulin. This whole thing is a follicle, and what it does is it stores the thyroid hormone thyroxine, or T3 and T4, in a precursor form in this large extracellular space. This is one of the few endocrine glands with a lot of extracellular storage. And I mentioned in lecture, one of the reasons you have this large amount of extracellular storage, which you don't have in most of the other endocrine glands, is this is a way to really store the iodine. The tyrosine amino acid that's used to make T3, T4, or thyroxine, that's pretty easy to come by. Iodine can be a little bit patchy, so we've evolved a way to store a large amount of this precursor hormone with the iodine ions already attached. So if you're in an area where you can't eat the iodine, doesn't matter, you got a storage form here, so your metabolism won't drop and a predator won't eat you. So this is the thyroid follicle. Contents you can call thyroglobulin or colloid is acceptable. So the follicle includes the layer of cuboidal cells and all of thyroglobulin. Now out here, you'll see some cells that are not on the wall of a follicle. There's a follicle here, there's a follicle here, there's a follicle over to your left over here, one up top here. But this cell right here, and several others around it, they are not part of the wall of the follicle. At least you can't tell they are. This is a different population of cells. Call them extra follicular cells, or they're sometimes just called C cells. This is a different population of cells. They do not secrete the thyroxine or the triiodothyronine or tetraiodothyronine. They secrete calcitonin. which, as you can probably maybe surmise from the name, calcitonin helps to lower blood calcium levels. It'll target the bone, for example, deposit excess calcium on the bone for use later. This is the same gland. It's from a different animal. The previous one was a human. I have no idea what mammal this thing came from, but it's a lower magnification. But again, you can see the follicles. There's a big one there, a big one there, and all of these right here, there's one, there's one. Those are smaller follicles, and it pretty much looks the same. Again, follicle there, there's a small one here, a small one here. Now this cracked area here, you see how you got this different texture in the middle and then a white area out here? That's just an artifact. That's probably embedding media that contracted a bit. This would still all be thyroglobulin if it were an intact thyroid gland. So that's, again, more thyroid. And down here, this thing, this is not the thyroid gland. Even though in humans it's embedded in the thyroid gland, this is the parathyroid gland. We usually give you a field of view that looks something like this in the microscope, so you'll be able to see a bit of the thyroid. That's kind of a giveaway. But the parathyroid, no follicles. It's just a dense mass of cells in here. And it secretes, surprisingly enough, parathyroid hormone, which is antagonistic to calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone will raise blood calcium levels, which is actually a little more critical. Low blood calcium, your heart quits, your nervous system quits, which tends to be kind of detrimental. So a parathyroid gland, you got 4 of them. There's just one on this slide, and it secretes parathyroid hormone. This is one of about 3 different slides we're looking at, lab. It's all a pituitary gland, which is also called the hypophysis. And I'll usually give you this field of view right here, so you can see both of them. Over here is the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis. And on your right over here is the posterior pituitary or neurohypophysis. I'll use posterior and anterior pituitary, but you will see hypophysis in a lot of the texts. This crack here is an artifact that won't be present in all of the slides, but it's actually present in many. And what you'll notice over here on your right, the posterior pituitary, because it's made of basically a bunch of axons and a few glial cells, it does not stain very well. I mean, this thing is almost always very light. You know, the few dots you see here are glial cells. There are no nuclei of the neurons over here. They're up in the hypothalamus. And nervous tissue does not stain very well with our, your standard eosine hematoxylin stain. So it's almost always going to be lighter. The 2 hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary, let's see if I can write with my mouse, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which targets the kidney and causes your kidney to reabsorb water. It's a hormone, as we'll see later, that you use to control blood concentration or osmotic strength. So it'll either put water into the blood or not, and that'll control blood concentration. The other hormone, we've used an example, I think, of positive feedback. Oxytocin also comes from the posterior pituitary, and as we've mentioned, that controls smooth muscle contraction, particularly of the uterus and some of the smooth muscle and reproductive mammary glands, that sort of thing. Now, over on your left, the anterior pituitary, again, that does develop from the epithelial tissue lining the Rathke's pouch or oral cavity of the embryo. It's not modified nervous tissue like the posterior pituitary. So it stains more darkly, a lot more nuclei, picks up a lot more stain. So it's usually much more obvious. I think we'll go over about 6 hormones from the anterior pituitary in lecture. You've got luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which target the gonads, ovaries or testes. You've got growth hormone, which targets, well, the liver and to some degree other tissues. Of course, causes growth. You've got you've got thyroid stimulating hormone we've mentioned, which targets the thyroid. You've got prolactin, which targets the mammary glands, as well as the gonads. And let's see, there's one more in there. Oh, something called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, targets the adrenal cortex. And that, of course, is also a tropic hormone. So here's one slide of the pituitary. We'll look at 1 or 2 more. All right, another pituitary slide. This is one we've rotated out of your boxes so you won't see it much. But over here, again, posterior pituitary. Again, it's lighter, more nervous tissue in it, mostly neurons. Well, it's all nervous tissue. Doesn't stain as well. Up here, kind of top left, that's the anterior pituitary. Again, more typical glandular epithelia. This one is a high magnification of the anterior pituitary. It's trying to show the differential staining you can get in the anterior pituitary. Different cells will stain differently depending on which class of hormones they secrete. I won't ask you this. This is a much higher magnification that we get in with our microscopes. We only go to, well, we go to about 400. This is a little higher. The problem with the differential staining is it is species specific. You see three different colors in there. You see some kind of blue cells, some clear cells, and some reddish stained cells. There are acidophils, basophils, and chromophobes, but don't worry about it too much. Again, it's species specific, and I don't even know what species this slide is from, so I typically don't use it. Now, this is an ovary. We'll look at this some more when we do the female reproductive system. For now, I just told you identified as the ovary, secretes the two female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, which target primarily the inner layer of the uterus, the endometrium, prep it for implantation of a fertilized egg. There are these large structures in here. These are also called follicles. Of course, they're fluid-filled sort of balls, but they're not the same as a thyroid follicle. They just are fluid-filled structures. These contain an oocyte. So the ovarian follicles, that little thing right there, is an egg or oocyte. There's another one over there to your left, one down at the bottom, one at the far left. I'll tell you why these are missing an oocyte later. But we'll look at the stages of development of these follicles in a couple of weeks. For now, ovary, estrogen, progesterone, that's all you need. This one, again, it's another ovary. This is so we can look at some details of some of the structures in a couple of weeks. Again, you'll have oocyte or egg. You'll have some corona radiata, some granulosa cells there. This whole thing's a follicle. They have different stages. We'll look at that a little later. For now, again, it's still just the ovary. Here's a cross-section through a testes. What you see is a bunch of these sections through the tube-like structures called seminiferous tubules, which make the sperm. There's one there. Let's outline a couple of them. Depending on how the section goes through the tube, they may look like circles or ovals. And on some of them, you hit them at a funny angle, so you get these crazy-looking things like this. But they're all seminiferous tubules. That is the bulk of the testes. Seminiferous tubules make the sperm. But then you've got some groups of cells, like right here, there's a few. See those little black dots? And you got a few right here, some little black dots right there. The cells that are not part of the seminiferous tubules, they call them interstitial cells or cells of lightage. They're the endocrine cells. They produce the testosterone. This is also a slide of the testes and the epididymis, a different organ. Up here is the epididymis. We'll talk about that again next week when we do male reproductive. But that is a section through the epididymis, which lies right alongside the testes. They're also tube-like, but one of the ways you'll tell them apart from the seminiferous tubules, you can see the outer edge of that tubule right there, and then you see the inner edge. It's sharply defined. It's like you cut through a rubber hose, and you may see sperm in the middle of these things depending on how it was prepped. Down here, if you look at the bottom, this is seminiferous tubule. The outer surface of the tube, when it's sectioned, is pretty well defined. This intersection, it's just kind of ragged looking. It kind of goes, well, okay, I'm going a little too spastic with the mouse. But that's because the sperm are produced and they're just kind of being sloughed off and released into the middle. It's got it doesn't have a sharp edge to it. That's one of the easy ways to tell. If I want epididymis, I usually give it to you like this, so you can see it right alongside the testes. These big things here, these are arteries and veins. Don't worry about those yet. This is a connective tissue between the epididymis and the testes. All right, this is the adrenal gland. Now, I usually go into a little more detail with the adrenal gland, but because of what's up this semester, I am not. But what you'll notice on this one, I don't even think this one's in your box anymore. I think this is a kind of a poor section through a human adrenal gland. And what you notice, this area I'm highlighting is a little darker than the rest. That's the adrenal medulla. Then out here, around it, out here, all the way to the capsule there at the edge, and out here, goes off the screen. That's the cortex. Again, the cortex secretes, I think we mentioned aldosterone, cortisol, and some androgens, male sex hormones. The adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine, norepinephrine, which reinforce the fight or flight response. Let me look at the next slide. It's got a little bit more detail.